There are people who think that Keir Starmer has all sorts of fine plans for social reform and so on. I don't see any evidence of it. All he's been doing so far is purifying the Labour Party of any militant activist elements. There are very natural trading and commercial relations between Britain and the continent. These have obviously been harmed. So it turns Britain, even more than before, into basically a vassal of the United States. Jeremy Corbyn tried to create a Labour Party that would be a participatory party, not just run by elites. That set off alarm bells through the whole establishment. If there's a picket line, it is preventing you from doing something you want to do. If you have any sense of solidarity with working people, you don't cross picket lines.
Noam Chomsky, hello. How's it going?
How are you?
I'm
Good
very
to be
well.
with you.
Yes, glad to have you here. I'd like to talk to you about a number of things, the British political scene, as well as what's happening internationally. To start with domestic affairs here in Britain, we're currently going through a period of intense industrial disputes in Britain, with historic strikes amongst groups like nurses, junior doctors, railway workers. What's your analysis of the current situation with trade unions in Britain, and also in relation to their future? We're obviously seeing the British government trying to pass legislation that will significantly impinge the right to strike here in the UK.
Go back 40 years when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan inaugurated what's called Neoliberalism, basically a form of class war. One of their first acts was to attack the labor unions. That made good sense. When you're going to carry out an assault against working people and the poor, eliminate the means of defense. Main means of defense are labor unions. That opened the doors to corporate expansion of modes of crushing worker organization. I know the details better in the United States, but it was about the same in England. That led to a very significant weakening of the labor movement and opened the doors to basically highway robbery by the very rich in England, by austerity programs, by the huge establishment attack on Jeremy Corbyn when he tried to create a genuine Labour Party. They weren't going to tolerate that. And now there is a reaction, both in the United States and Britain. And of course, the government is trying it. The government, which is essentially the government of the rich and the corporate sector, is trying to maintain the controls over labor and repression of labor so as to enable this highly successful class war to proceed. And it is highly successful. I don't know the figures for England, but in the United States, about $50 trillion, it's not small change, have been transferred from working people and the poor to the top 1% during the class war mislabeled neoliberalism. It's pretty, nope. The guys who run the thing don't want that gravy train to stop.
I'd like to talk about Jeremy Corbyn in a little bit more detail in a moment, but for the moment, sticking to the trade union movement and sort of its attempted revival, at least in Britain at the moment. A lot of the media discourse that surrounds the trade unions and their industrial action in Britain focuses on the inconvenience that the strikes cause to the regular public. So, delays to operations or the inability to commute into work, rather than focusing on the industrial dispute, the conditions of the workers, the reasons for these things happening. Why do you think the media covers strike action and industrial action more broadly in the way that it does?
You'd you have to have much more information than I do about the options available to working people. Quite generally, strikes do have some degree of negative impact on the public. In a decent society, public supports that. That's why we don't cross picket lines. If there's a picket line and it is preventing you from doing something you want to do. But if you have any sense of solidarity with working people, or you don't cross picket lines. That goes way back.
What do you think of the future is then for the trade union movement? We don't have to talk specifically about Britain, but more broadly in the West. I know that in America, at least, some workers in Amazon, for example, are trying to unionize, and I believe the same is happening in Starbucks. Is that right?
Yes, and it's striking that it's happening in basically service industries, because one part of the class war of the past 40 years has been the effort to deindustrialize the major economies, the United States, Britain, to a lesser extent others. Get much more profit if you can use easily exploited workers and lower wages and no repressive governments, no environmental constraints. So every move was made by the global planners to facilitate the corporate transfer of operations to places where it's more profitable and exploitation is easier. That's how the World Trade Organization was structured, basically as an investor rights system which facilitated transfer of work to places which should be more profitable for the ownership class. There was nothing inevitable about that. No economic theory behind it. Just let's enrich ourselves. And there are strike waves now going on in the service sector, to some extent in the more limited industrial sector. And it's very difficult. By now, the sophistication of strike breaking has become quite extensive. A lot of it's illegal. But when you have a criminal state, it doesn't matter. You can carry out illegal acts. So in the United States, the National Labor Relations Board has been severely weakened, which is supposed to prevent illegal actions, defunded, weakened, not even members appointed. It's been slightly improved under Biden, but this is a 45-year project. So there's a lot to recover. And the economy in general, domestic economy, has shifted considerably from production of goods to production of wealth, with the huge growth of financial institutions, most of them predatory, but they do increase private wealth, not production. You take a look at a corporation like Apple, the world's leading corporation. You look at its research and development programs over the years, they've declined. There's more involvement in financial manipulations of one or another kind, which are more profitable and don't improve products. Then, of course, they don't have to bother paying taxes, because set up an office in Ireland and claim that's your corporate headquarters. Maybe all kind of shenanigans have been designed to enable the class war to proceed more effectively. All of this has to be recovered somehow. In England, there's an extra problem. Brexit, that's going to be very harmful to England and hard to overcome. But No, it's there. It doesn't work with it. The United States, it's different kinds of problems. The manufacturing was very much in rural areas, all factories, so on, all gone. And that leaves a rural environment which is bitter, angry, resentful, rightly. They've been shafted, easy prey for demagogues, and we see that happening.
Would you be able to talk in a little bit more detail what you mentioned there about Brexit and its consequences for the United Kingdom? Why do you believe that Brexit will be harmful to the United Kingdom?
There are very, very natural trading and commercial relations between Britain and the continent. These have obviously been harmed. That harms both Europe and Britain. Britain more so because it's weaker. So it turns Britain even more than before into basically a vassal of the United States. And it restricts the opportunities in England for the kind of healthy relations that could develop with with continental Europe. That's kind of intrinsic to the breakup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do wonder then, is that your view that Britain's role in domestic politics now, international politics now, is as a vassal of the United States? Because much of the rhetoric, I'm sure you're familiar with it, around the decision to leave the European Union from the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson was about this sort of swashbuckling Great Britain that would go out and strike free trade deals all around the world and become, an independent global power. I can see you smirking already as I reel these quotes off.
That was always a fantasy, aside maybe from the city of London, which could be a major financial center, though even that's harmed by the Brexit, since it shifts capital centers to other places. But that can remain, and there can remain considerable wealth concentrated in England. Well, the farmer industrial sectors, northern England and so on, just decline, collapse, which is what's been happening. Even harsher because of the austerity programs, which had no economic basis, but did have a class basis.
One of the, I think possibly lies we tell ourselves in Britain is that we have this special relationship with the United States, that the relationship isn't, as you just described it, as a vassal state. The power is asymmetrical. Why do you view that relationship in that asymmetrical way rather than perhaps as something different or unique in foreign policy?
Well, go back to the 1940s. The British Foreign Office recognized in the late 40s that Britain was handing over the mantle of global leadership to the United States. As the Foreign Office put it, Britain's future was to be a junior partner to the United States, just because of the circumstances left at the end of the Second World War. Don't have to go through the details. It's pretty obvious. And some British diplomats pointed out that, forget the exact word, but something like this, the United States will tell us, this is what's good for you, and you can do it if you like, and if you don't like, you're going to do it anyway. They put it more eloquently, but it's approximately like that. And that's the arrangement. The special relationship means the United States does what it wants. Britain observes and follows the rules. If the United States doesn't look like what Britain's doing, it kicks it in the face. Happens over and over, even when Britain's survival is at stake. But take the Cuban Missile Crisis. The real threat, there was a severe nuclear threat. It was going to hit Europe and Britain was very unlikely to hit the United States, even if it blew up, because Russia didn't even have intercontinental missiles. I think about 4. But Britain and Europe would be severely impacted if there was a military crisis. The United States didn't even inform Britain of what was happening. If you look at the XCOM, we have the transcripts of the U.S. high-level meetings during the missile crisis. XCOM meetings, they were called. Kennedy, McNamara, all the rest. I mean, the question of informing Britain, because it came up, shall we let Britain know what's happening? But the answer was, no, it's none of their business. They're not mature enough. The Europeans are emotional. They're not mature like us, so we're not going to tell them anything. I mean, Harold Macmillan was desperate to try to find out what's going on. He tried to get what he could from British intelligence, but he didn't have a lot of information. Here, Britain's survival was at stake, but the United States wouldn't even inform them of what plans are being made because they're not mature enough. We are the ones who understand how to do things. You should read those. It's very striking, the contempt for Britain, particularly, and Europe altogether. It's quite striking. Not the only case. Skybolt case was another. In fact, the United States is the godfather, does what it wants. If the subordinates go along, okay. If they don't go along, tough for them. That's the special relationship.
You recently claimed that Jeremy Corbyn had a historic victory in 2017. Why do you think it's important to recognise that result and describe it in those terms?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn, who's a very decent person, tried to create a Labour Party that would be a participatory party, not just run by elites and the parliament, and it would furthermore work for the interests of its constituents, and was very successful. 2017 vote increased the Labour vote by huge amounts, I think more than in about 50 years. Now, that set off alarm bells through the whole establishment. Can't allow this. We can't have a political party that's a participatory party and that represents its constituents. It's not the way politics works. Politics works run by small elites who tell everyone else what to do. Then came the establishment attack on Corbyn, which was impressive, concocting all kind of tales about anti-Semitism, all exploded, even in the early days. At the beginning of this campaign, Greg Philo at the Glasgow Media Centre he and his group wrote a book analyzing it, tearing it to shreds, all fake, didn't matter. Later it was all totally exposed by the Al Jazeera series, Labour series, but even Labour's own internal analysis fundamentally conceded it was total fakery across the board, all the way to the Guardian. Can't allow this. And he was basically destroyed. He's pretty much been kicked out of the Labour Party. It's true of other organizers recently. What's his name? Henry Driscoll, I think, one of the activists. And it's just not going to tolerate this. It's going to be a top-down party. No constituents.
Yeah, the mayor you're referencing, I think, in the northeast, Jamie Driscoll, who's been prevented from standing in the seats changing, and he's standing. Well, he's not going to be allowed to stand there. Why do you think that result in 2017 isn't more widely recognised in the terms that you've just described, or indeed discussed in mainstream discourse? Is it because of the threat that Corbyn posed to the establishment?
Mainstream discourse is not representative of the public any more than the political parties are. they answer to different voices. I've studied this mostly in the United States, but it's pretty much the same in England. The United States, the top political economist, fine political economist, who's done the major work on these issues, Thomas Ferguson, extensive work on the effect of what he calls the investment theory of politics. He traced it back over a century and traced the funding of political organizations related to the policies that are pursued. You find very high correlations. For Congress, campaign funding almost predicts electability and the policies that are then followed. And this, of course, has consequences. One consequence is, again, for the United States, where there is extensive study in the mainstream political science literature. Turns out that a considerable majority of the voters, about 70%, are simply not represented. Meaning, if you study the correlation between their attitudes and concerns and the votes of their own congressional representatives, there's essentially no correlation. And you can see the mechanisms very simply, straightforward. It's not deep. Suppose you're elected to Congress. First thing you have to do is get on the telephone, call the donors, and tell them, please fund me for the next election that's coming up. If you don't have the big donors, you're not going to win the election. Well, while you're on the phone buttering up your donors, your staff, mostly young people, committed young people, is being overwhelmed by corporate lobbyists, corporate lawyers, or in to tell them how they have to write the legislation and so on. They don't have the resources to combat this. So what comes out is corporate-ridden legislation. Then the elected representative, when he gets off the phone, comes back to his office and signs the legislation. I'm exaggerating, but that's basically the structure of the system. You don't want to break that up by having functioning constituent-based political parties. Why stop the gravy train? It's called class war, which dominates what happens. You can give it other fancy names if you like neoliberalism, or economic orthodoxy, or something like that. But that's basically what it is, and you see the results.
But I think it would be fair to say that one of the current themes of this discussion is corporate power and what appears to be hegemonic corporate power that is capable of overpowering the state, the people, and their politics. I mean, it's hard not to despair. What do you see as routes to challenging that hegemony, those corporate interests? How can, for example, if particularly in the context of this conversation about Jeremy Corbyn, if that's one of the closest attempts that, let's say, the British public has gotten to challenging those interests, what hope do they have for the future?
It's happened before. It's not the first time. Go back to my childhood, 1930s. In the 1920s, the labor unions had been virtually crushed in the United States. In England, there were other processes which essentially eliminated the very lively guild socialism of the early post-war period, crushed and contained by austerity programs, by the principle of separating economic decision-making from public involvement. There's a very good study of this, if you're interested, by Clara Mattei in her recent book on, I forget what it's called, but fine book on the early post-war crushing of labor initiatives in Italy, fascism in England, other methods like separating economic public uh, policy from economic decision making. It's very striking. In the United States, the labor movement was just crushed by Woodrow Wilson's repression, vicious repression. But in the 1930s, it began to reconstitute. Industrial organizing, CIO organizing, militant labor actions, popular activism, political parties, a very lively period. There was a sympathetic administration, the Roosevelt administration, and it was pressed into taking actions initiated modern social democracy. The New Deal measures, which were, and the corporate reaction was quite interesting. It was split. Actually, Tom Ferguson, who I mentioned, has done the main scholarly work on this. But if you look back to the 30s, corporate world was divided on how to respond to the significant social democratic measures being undertaken by the Roosevelt administration. Turns out that capital-intensive, internationally oriented capital, like General Electric, were moderately sympathetic. They didn't mind much. It's fine with them. They could have a controlled workforce, which is unionized, have fairly decent wages, stabilize the economy. They were internationally oriented, so they liked the trade programs of the New Deal. They didn't object. But a labor-intensive, domestically oriented industry was violently opposed to the New Deal. There was a split. Then came the Second World War. Well, there was a mobilization of the state-led mobilization of the economy to switch to wartime production. It's very successful. But notice how it had to be done. It had to observe what was called the Stimson Doctrine, a very critical principle. Henry Stimson was the Secretary of War. He was in charge of the mobilization of the economy for war. And he explained, virtually in these words, he said, look, in a capitalist society, if you want to get anything done, you have to make sure the business world is happy. That's the nature of a capitalist society. So you guys out there, like my family, can have your victory garden, stop driving, and have wage controls. But meanwhile, we have to have cost-plus contracts for the business world, or they're not going to cooperate. So you can reinforce the power of capital in order to get anything done. Stimson Doctrine is very significant, holds very clearly today. When the Biden administration tries to push through some climate programs, they have to be based on bribery of the fossil fuel companies and the banks. You can't just push through programs to cut back emissions. You have to follow the Stimson Doctrine. So see if you can bribe the rich by subsidies, credits, maybe they'll go along. That's the nature of a capitalist economy. Stimson was quite correct. But the labor movement in the 30s did reconstitute and had a major effect on the New Deal policies, which pretty much were at the forefront for the emerging social democracy of the following years. Well, the business offensive immediately picked up force at the end of the Second World War, immediately. Attacks on labor unions, Taft-Hartley Act, enormous corporate propaganda to try to undermine labor and social reform, and didn't work right away. It took some time. So the 50s and the 60s still following basically New Deal policies. By the 70s, the corporate offensive was, the business offensive was taking force. Then Reagan came along, just opened the doors with Thatcher. And we get into the period of open, savage class war of the past 40 years. And that misses a lot of details, obviously, but I think in rough outline, it's pretty much what happened. Also a shift from production of goods to production of wealth, critical part of the neoliberal assault. Wealth production for the rich, kind of neo-feudal. Didn't even describe that way. Feudal system produced wealth, didn't produce goods. That's the system we're moving towards.
It's a brief history, but I certainly think it's an accurate history. I mean, within the context of that, then, politicians who are perhaps capable of potentially driving meaningful and radical change and reversing that class warfare that you've described in detail so far. The current leader of the Labour Party in Britain is Keir Starmer. Do you think he's capable of delivering those things we've just discussed?
Well, so far, there are people like Will Hutton, for example, who think that Keir Starmer has all sorts of fine plans for social reform and so on. I don't see any evidence of it. All he's been doing so far is purifying the Labour Party of any militant activist elements and putting it onto more central control, eliminating people like Corbyn, of course, Driscoll recently, and others who do work for a constituent-based party with dealing with needs of the constituency, Labour constituency. So it seems to me he'll probably move towards a Blairite-style parliamentary, elite parliamentary party, Thatcher Light, as it used to be called.
We're currently seeing as well, I believe this political movement has more weight in the States, but the national conservatism is how it's described. And there's been an attempt to import it, that sort of American evangelical far-right ideology, towards the British right and what potentially happens to the Conservative Party if it is defeated in an upcoming election, and the kind of ideological contest for the soul of the party. Do you think that that brand of right-wing politics in America is compatible with British politics? Could you see the ideas of national conservatism translating over to the Conservative Party in Britain?
Well, you know better than I do, but I think there are grounds for it. In the United States, there's been an enormous, the evangelical movement has always been very powerful. Way back to the founding fathers, the United States was pretty much off the spectrum in terms of religious extremism. Providentialism. Until pretty recent, even the United States you look at public attitudes in the United States, it's pretty shocking. About half the population expects Jesus to return in the next generation or two. If you look at attitudes towards evolution, probably 10% of the population accepts the beliefs that you and I have about evolution. Maybe 40% believes in church and divine guided evolution. The rest say the world was created 10,000 years ago. This is extended by an enormous anti-science movement, which is quite powerful. It goes back a century. The corporations that were producing lethal products like lead, tobacco, asbestos, recently fossil fuels, scientific information was beginning to accumulate about a century ago that about the harmful effects of these products. Corporate sector recognized that it's no use to deny the facts. If you try to deny them, you'll just be refuted. They picked another path. Let's sow doubt about science. Why should we believe scientists? They keep changing their minds. They're bought by big corporations. They, a bunch of liberals. They're mostly liberals. Why should we believe them? So let's sow doubt about science altogether. That's had a big effect. That's had effect in all kind of areas. It's a large part of the basis for the anti-vaccine movement, which I was surprised to see in recent polls is pretty large in Britain. I think about a third of the population thinks COVID was a conspiracy. All of this is coming out of the major corporate-led anti-science movement, which is going on for a century. And had extremely harmful effects. Can't calculate the number of people murdered by this, just from the lethal products like lead, tobacco, and so on. But now it's survival of human species. We don't deal with fossil fuel overuse. We're finished. But it doesn't matter to the corporate sector. They have to make profit tomorrow. Incidentally, I don't blame them for that. If you're the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank, and you have to decide whether to fund fossil fuel industry, you can imagine what's in your mind. Say, well, I know I'm killing my grandchildren. I'm literate and I follow this. But what's my choice? Suppose I stop funding them. I'm kicked out. Somebody else comes in who's even worse than, doesn't have my good sentiments, he'll be even worse. It's the nature of the institutions. You either play by the rules or you're out. Okay? That's the Stimson doctrine again. So those are realities that we can't ignore. Can do something about them. Like the social democratic reforms did do a lot, in fact. But there's got to be a much more fundamental overturning of the enormous class power of concentrated wealth, or the options are quite limited.
If the polling you're referencing there about Brits believing that the pandemic was a conspiracy, if it's the same one I'm thinking of, I would just urge caution, because I think the sample was selective. So it was 30% of people that are familiar with the conspiracy theory believe it, and I think the majority of the population weren't familiar with the conspiracy theory. So I think there was a slight technicality there. If we're talking about the same thing, let's move the conversation on. Let's talk about AI. You recently said in an interview with Piers Morgan, in fact, that the threat to humanity from the current iteration of AI is largely overstated. Why did you say that?
Well, there's a lot of propaganda that comes out of Silicon Valley, which basically amounts to, look how smart we are, pour money into us. There you get talk about singularity, machines becoming so intelligent that they'll rule us and so on. That's possible in principle, but it's so remote and so distant from anything that exists that it's hardly worth thinking about. Now, the current AI, which has departed from the early efforts in AI, first, you go back to the pioneers of AI, people like Alan Turing, Herb Simon, Marvin Minsky in the early days. They were really interested in what's now called cognitive science, which barely existed at the time. Can we use the emerging technology, computer technology, and new discoveries in mathematical theory of computation Can we use this to learn things about human intelligence? People like Geoffrey Hinton, one of the pioneers who just pulled out in dismay, was trying to see if the models that were being constructed on the basis of neural nets could teach you something about the brain. That kind of interest has mostly disappeared. Now it's become almost a pure engineering project. Can we do something that sells, basically? Doesn't tell us anything about language, learning, cognition, just works. Well, there's nothing wrong with technology. In fact, I'm using it right now. The captions that I'm reading, because I'm hard of hearing, are developed by deep learning technology. For that, it's quite useful. Maybe it's useful for other things, but it's not teaching us anything. It's not intended to. It's as if somebody's studying insect navigation and want to figure out how insects navigate. And someone comes along and says, it's not a problem, I can do it with GPS and high technology and so on. We'd laugh, That's essentially what it is. So the technology can be, like other technology, can be useful, can be harmful. Up to our decision is how to use it. But it's not part of science anymore. It's not telling us anything.
And is it fair to categorize your greater concerns being the prospect of nuclear war or indeed ecological collapse posing far more of a threat to our society than any artificial intelligence can?
By orders of magnitude. I mean, actually, the misuse of AI might enhance these problems. So if missile defense systems are automated with AI technology, we're probably dead. They make too many errors. There's a long record, in fact, of missile defense and the errors that were made by the automated systems, which were aborted by human intervention. Very serious cases, and thousands of them. I mean, we could run through. If there's more automation, there'll probably be hopeless errors, terminal errors. So could be very harmful. But it's harmful right now in other ways. So it's the things like the chatbot, the systems that are getting a huge amount of attention. Terrific for disinformation, for defamation, for preying on people's gullibility, in many cases. So, for example, with contemporary technology, AI technology, it would be possible to construct an artificial image of you, which looks pretty realistic, and to duplicate your voice, and to have you say some totally outrageous thing that, except for expert analysis, people couldn't tell whether it's real or not. There's already been some kind of games with this, like with the Pope, as you may have seen. But that can become a major industry. Disinformation, when big players get involved, disinformation can become uncontrollable. It's and just preying on gullibility is no small point. People are misled by these things. There are many cases by now where people ask serious questions from their chatbot. Should I leave my job and move to another city? They get an answer and they pay attention to it. You fall for these things. There are many cases attested already. All of these are really serious dangers. Singularity, I think you can not worry about. Theoretically, yes, but very remote.
As we draw to the end of this conversation, I've two shorter questions for you. The first is, what gives you hope?
The fact that people are struggling, mostly young people, to try to overcome the immediate crises, like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, Amazon workers. All of these things are plenty of grounds for hope. And they're all over the global south as well. The popular movements in the global south are in Latin America, for example, are organizing to try to resist the very harmful assaults of the last 40, 45 years. Very hard. Struggle is never easy, but it goes on, and that's enough to have plenty of hope.
What's your advice then for future generations of thinkers and activists confronted with those struggles?
Have a very simple choice. Either you say it's hopeless and help ensure that the worst will happen, or you grasp the opportunities that exist. Maybe you can make it a better world. Basically, that's it.
Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good.